Plans for the latest line in the country's massive push for high-speed rail have been announced. HS2. HS1 links London with the Channel Tunnel. HS2 should link London with the Midlands and the North, and it's in the advanced stage of planning at the moment. And HS3 could be a £7 billion upgrade to the network between Manchester and Leeds, which the Chancellor hopes will be a step towards the creation of a northern powerhouse. Are these lines long overdue? I want to hear a snapshot of your experience of rail travel. Is it a difficult journey? And is it affecting your life and your work and your business? Or has the train liberated you and got you out of the car? Tell me what you think of your rail services. Rail analyst Christian Walmar is on hand to help. That number again, 03700 100 444. And Janice in Devon has dialed it. Janice, you think we've got our focus wrong, don't you?
Yes, Shari. I'm surprised no one's mentioned this before. I live in the far southwest in Plymouth in Devon, and I moved here 31 years ago, and it was the proud boast of British Rail that you could get from Plymouth to Paddington in 3 hours. Well, 31 years later, the fastest train I can get is 3 hours, 7 minutes.
So it's a whole different kind of east-west divide, isn't it? It's not the Manchester, Liverpool, Hull, Leeds, east-west.
No, it's this perception that, you know, we're all wandering around in smocks and chewing straws, and really it doesn't matter too much once you're far west of Bristol.
How much does it...
We are fairly well into the 21st century down here. But, I mean, for example, going down from Plymouth to Penzance at the height of the season, at 9 o'clock, the peak time, with a lot of travellers with cases and buckets and spades, they put on a 2-carriage multiple unit for all those people. It's the journey from hell. There's no luggage storage space, no refreshment facilities, and you just suffer.
So your daily life, how does the train affect you?
Well, fortunately it doesn't, because I'm a lady of leisure and I'm retired and I'm disabled. So when I do go by train, I get disabled help, and that's wonderful. But, you know, if I wanted to go up to London just for the day, just for a little treat or a meeting, well, it's virtually impossible, not to mention the prices. You know, £259 for a day.
Really?
Yeah.
£259?
If you book on the day, yeah.
And going to Bristol isn't much better for you in Plymouth, is it?
Oh, that's a lot better. Well, having said that, if you want to go to Exeter from Plymouth, it's only 40 miles, and that takes an hour. And Bristol is about an hour and a half. That's just about manageable. It's that. I mean, I used to live in Bath, and you could do Bath to London in just over an hour, and it's half the distance. It's just this perception that we don't matter down in the southwest.
Janice in Devon, thank you. Well, James is in Brighton. You have a slightly different problem, don't you?
There's a number of things. I'm originally from Dawlish, where the train track was washed away in the storms in the southwest. And I used to go to school from Dawlish to Torquay every morning. This is about 20 years ago when privatisation was first mooted. And if I go there today, I'm now nearly 40. The trains are smaller than when I was a schoolboy. I think they're the same trains as when I was a schoolboy. They're rammed to the gills. They're too expensive. You can't travel on the spur of the moment. Need I go on? Coming into Brighton, I now live in Brighton. I avoid the train whenever possible. I recently flew in to Gatwick, and I got into Gatwick at about 11 o'clock. I think it was a Sunday night, to find that both trains heading south to Brighton were within 3 minutes of each other. And I've just flown in from Europe, where the train's fantastic. They run all night in Amsterdam.
James, I'm going to leave it there because the telephone line is a bit poor, and I'll move on to Alison in Northern Ireland. Alison, your experience is completely different from...
Oh, absolutely. We're lucky. Being a small country, we have only one train operator, and that's TransLink. And I have to say, I mean, I would travel by train rather than by bus any day of the week. The trains are clean, they're punctual, and they're well designed. And the staff are friendly and helpful. So, you know, I've died and gone to heaven, and there are trains there.
And it's not just the actual trains, it's the people who work on them, it's the whole service, you say.
It's the whole service. I mean, you know, if you're making the same journey, you get to know the staff, and they're just so friendly. They really are. They're lovely people. It's a pleasure to meet them.
Now, the difference is, your train service in Northern Ireland is nationalised.
Yes. We just have the one operator, so nobody's fighting anybody else. And I mean, the trains, all the trains now, as far as I know, I don't travel on all the lines, but all the ones that I've travelled on now have been upgraded, and new carriages. And so when you get on the newest versions, when you get on any of the carriages, the first two seats are parallel with the side of the carriage as opposed to at right angles. So if you've come on with a pram or a large object, you're not fighting your way up a narrow space between the rows of seats. They're excellent. They really are.
Do you commute, Alison?
No. Well, I mean, anytime I'm going into Belfast, it's just a couple of stops for me. But I would, if I'm stuck, I'll take the bus. But more often than not, I travel by train because it's just so comfortable and the trains are clean. But
because you don't commute, you don't necessarily travel in the rush hour. Do you think it's a different experience for people who do?
Well, now, last year I travelled to a town called Portadown, and that would have been in the rush hour, and the trains were pretty packed. But there was only one occasion where I didn't actually get a seat for part of the journey. But I mean, I'd still rather travel by train than travel by bus.
Alison in Northern Ireland, thank you. Well, HS2 hasn't even started building yet, and we're talking about HS3. In a moment, we'll hear from the Transport Minister, Baroness Kramer. But first, I asked the BBC's North of England correspondent, Dan Johnson, what exactly the government's agreed to.
Well, there's not a great deal of detail yet on this plan. There isn't even commitment. It seems to be an ambition, really, at the moment to speed up journeys across the north. As you say, HS2 still at this stage, just a set of plans and animations. And already they're talking about HS3 speeding up journeys between the big northern cities. But we're not talking about a brand new dedicated high-speed line here. It sounds like this is going to be more a case of improving the existing lines across the north of England to improve the journey times, to relieve some of the bottlenecks and the overcrowding that already exists on those Transpennine routes. But no detail about exactly what the route will be between these cities, when it will be delivered, or how much it will cost.
So what issues does high-speed rail plan to address at the moment?
Currently, the journey between Leeds and Manchester takes almost an hour, even though it's only 40 miles. The intention is to bring that down to something around 26 minutes. The ambition is extending those improvements out to the other northern cities, Liverpool, Hull, Newcastle, Sheffield, as well as Leeds and Manchester. The northern city political leaders have complained that journey times aren't good enough across the north. It's not supporting the economy there, and they made loud calls as HS2 was being proposed to speed up journeys to London. They said this needed to be addressed across the north of England as well. And the Prime Minister recognising that in his announcement yesterday, he said this is about rebalancing Britain's economy.
Well, listening to that is Baroness Kramer, the Minister of State for Transport, Liberal Democrat. Now, Baroness Kramer, there's an election coming. Do you think that the fierce opposition we've seen for HS2 still has the capacity to influence whether HS3 will happen?
The arguments, I think, for HS3 are just overwhelming, and we have incredibly poor connection east-west, and that has to change because we're looking to the Midlands and the North to be a powerhouse of our economy for the future. It matters that you have good connections in Manchester, Leeds, but not just Manchester, Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield, onto Hull, Liverpool. All of that is going to be crucially important to build the economy. I think a lot of the opposition to HS2 has come from a lack of understanding that London to Birmingham, it's a capacity issue. We are very much out of capacity and certainly will be by the 2020s. So we have to have a new line. When you move north of Birmingham, it's creating that rail infrastructure framework, the connectivity that lets the economy thrive.
Well, one of our listeners, Christopher Keogh, has emailed this morning, and he says if those time shavings are really over only 10 or 15 minutes, it's the journey from home to the station that takes the time. So if you're only saving 10 minutes off the main rail journey, is £7 billion really worth it?
I think it's crucial, and so do most of the leadership in the north, because it just creates that dynamic in the city. But of course you can't ignore the journey to the train station. And we're working on that through something we call the Local Growth Fund. But what we've done in the past is we've absolutely neglected the need to put in new modern infrastructure to create those better connections. And what we can't do now is go and repeat those mistakes of the past, because ignoring the need for that kind of connection in the Midlands and the North has played its role in making sure that those areas haven't thrived economically in the way that they really should have.
Well, Sir David Higgins, he's the chairman of HS2, says that the biggest risk you face is time. Delays mean that the budget rockets, and despite supposed cross-party talks already in parliamentary debates, there's been a lot of conditions here and caveats there. So how do you stop the MPs dragging this process out for years and pushing up the budget?
Well, HS2 will start going into the ground, presuming that we get our final approvals from Parliament, but we'll start going into the ground 2017. That is very soon. And then Sir David Higgins has been looking at ways to have a much tighter timetable to deliver both the first part of HS2, then to go on quicker to Crewe, and then indeed to deliver the whole project more quickly.
But
so
Crossrail,
that is very sensible.
Crossrail was 3 years in the committee stage alone.
Well, as I say, we expect to be in the ground 2017, and I don't think you'll find many people questioning that timetable. That's absolutely crucial. That will allow phase 1 to begin. There's a lot of work to do on phase 2, which is a much more complex project. So, for example, our thoughts around HS3 may well influence the way in which we develop the HS2 station at Leeds and how it works with the conventional station. So there are a lot of thinking to make sure that we get the HS2 right to work with all the connectivity that needs to be delivered east-west.
I hope you're talking to 5-year-olds, because David Higgins says that it's the 5-year-olds at school, just going to school now, who'll get the jobs as the apprentices on HS3. It's a long way off. So how are you going to ensure there's no dip in the customer service that people get as they travel backwards and forwards, as the train companies wait to see how all this pans out?
Well, what is exciting, frankly, in the railway industry is that it's suddenly gone from being an industry ignored and in decline to being an exciting, growing industry. I mean, in the next 5-year period, we're putting 38 billion into the railways, and it's not just HS2. That's where the conversation may seem to be often on the radios, but massive projects in terms of electrification, improvements of every kind on the system, new trains coming online. Look at completely new ways of doing signalling so we can run more trains much tighter together. I mean, we need about 10,000 people a year coming into the railway industry to meet the plans that we've got on the table. It's incredibly exciting.
Transport Minister Baroness Kramer. Lots of texts agreeing with Alison in Northern Ireland, who was talking about how good the rail services are in Northern Ireland, nationalised service there. And Stuart in Farnworth near Bolton says 1 train per hour during the week and none at all on Sundays from 3 smaller stations on the busy route from Bolton to Manchester is frustrating, and the network's missing out on potential customers. Well, today on Call You and Yours, we're asking, are you happy with your rail services? What needs to change? The government spends around £545 per person on transport in London, but if you're in Yorkshire and the Humber, it's half that, £246. But plans for a new high-speed link between Manchester and Leeds could change it. Christian is in Bath, in Somerset. Christian, you've lived in Switzerland for 25 years. What was it like there?
Oh, it was fine, thank you. We lived there for work for 25 years, and I had to commute an hour every day from my home to Geneva, and that's a major commuter line. And like I've mentioned in my email, Switzerland had the same problem over the high-speed train issue, which, because of the size of the country, was simply not feasible. And they also know there's hardly any flat land, so a lot of tunnels would have to be built. And Switzerland already has 3,000 tunnels, so they weren't very happy about building more. So they changed the whole strategy to what they called the Project Rail 2000, which was launched in 1995. And that meant the introduction of double-decker trains on all main lines to begin with, that was an expensive, if you like, the practical solution to the capacity, because that's the problem they've had. It was mainly a capacity problem and not a speed problem. That meant lifting tunnels. It meant lifting bridges, which they just got on with it and did it during the night when there was no rail traffic. All the platforms in the stations had to be lifted so that the train is level with the platform for prams, wheelchairs, and what have you.
That must have completely disabled the network. That's such a building project.
It hasn't at all, because it was all done during the night. There was not a single interruption to the rail service, because they only worked during the night from 1 a.m. until 5 a.m. every night.
So you think here in the UK, if these plans go ahead and we start building, actually the disruption won't be as serious as some people have complained about?
The technology and the engineering skills are there. Bridges can be lifted, tunnels can be made higher. And that's absolutely possible, and the Swiss have proved it, that they can do it. We have now 95% of the trains are double-decker trains, even the regional trains, which what we call the small trains, which go from the main station who connect to little villages and what have you. They're all double-decker trains, and that had to be done.
Christian in Bath, thank you very much. We've been asking for your views on rail travel, your experiences, and one listener to you and yours who's called us is the Sheffield MP, David Blunkett. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
What is your experience of train travel between Sheffield and, I was going to say London, but actually I mean Sheffield and anywhere else?
Well, I've got two members of my extended family who commute between Sheffield and Manchester, and if they get the train before 6:30 in the morning, they'll get a seat. If they don't, they won't, and they certainly often don't when they're coming back in the early evening. So the first thing we've got to do is actually not just have the aspiration that Baroness Susan Kramer was talking about for so-called HS3, a kind of wish list for 2030 or 2040, we've got to do something immediately, and that is part of the franchising programme for Transpennine and Northern Trains at the moment, is actually downgrading rather than upgrading what's going to be on offer. So if, to use a posh word, infrastructure means carriages. It means more carriages. It means more comfortable carriages. It means more frequent trains, and we want them now, as the old saying used to be. And we want them between Sheffield and Manchester, Liverpool, and to Hull, and not just Manchester Leeds, which is always talked about, which is the easy bit, to be honest.
You've got to start somewhere, though. You've got to have a wish list. I mean, I've done that Manchester Sheffield journey and Manchester Liverpool, and you're quite right. You know, you've got to take some shoes that you can stand up in, because you ain't going to get a seat.
And it's horrendous if you're doing that every day, and Helen Egan and Claire Williams are doing just that, then you're in difficulties. The other thing I would suggest is, and I can't understand, given the disparity that you were talking about a minute ago between what's spent in the north and what's spent in London, why we don't start HS2 at the same time as we're starting the London-Birmingham link, from Leeds and Manchester through Sheffield on the one side, Manchester Crewe, as they're proposing, to London on the other. And that way we'd get the economic activity and the growth, and we'd get the result of HS2 a lot earlier.
There is a question of time, isn't there? These things are, we're looking at 13, 14 years ahead. How bound up with caveats here, as we were talking to Baroness Kramer, and changes there, and politicking on either side are we going to get?
Well, that is a real danger. And I think, to be honest, as I come towards the end of my House of Commons bit of my political life, we've got to actually have a very clear agreement between the main parties. We've got to be able to say, this is determined. There will be hiccups. There will be obviously arguments about particular elements of the route. They're bound to be. But this is the commitment we're going to make, not just on HS2 and perhaps persuading that we should start in the north now rather than waiting until we've finished the Birmingham link, and that we will do something very practical and concrete as a gesture of not just goodwill but of intent in the north of England, northeast to northwest, on all those routes. And if we saw that happening, people would have confidence. It would have the economic growth activity, which everyone's now thankfully talking about, and it would empower and I think build confidence for business investment in the north of England, and we really do need it.
Sheffield MP David Blunkett, thank you for calling You and Yours. Well, Christian Wolmar is a rail analyst and he keeps a close eye on the industry. Christian, you've been listening patiently to a variety of opinions here. What, in your experience, is the major complaint from rail users? You heard David Blunkett there.
Well, the major complaints that I hear about from passengers are the hardy perennials, and that is delays. Although they've gone up a little bit in the last year or two, but they had gone down quite dramatically before that. But it's not so much the delays themselves; it's the way that when things happen, nobody quite knows what is going on and how to deal with it, and when people will eventually be able to get to their destinations. And the second one, of course, is value for money. And your first caller down in the West Country referred to that, and she spoke of a £250 trip to London. Now, not many people would have to pay that because they would either be on advance tickets or off-peak fares and the like, but nevertheless, sometimes you might have to. If you suddenly get a sick relative or something and have to jump on a train at 8:30 in the morning, you are paying absolutely exorbitant amounts, and that's certainly one of the things that passengers often express concern about.
Well, we've spoken to the Association of Train Operating Companies this morning about that, and they gave us a statement saying the government decides the average change to regulated fares, including season tickets, each year, and for decades successive governments have regulated commuter fares so as to increase the share of rails, the cost paid by the passengers rather than the taxpayer. Is that fair?
The key word there is regulated. The regulated fares are season tickets and off-peak fares, which are a good bargain. But
they were.
Well, generally, off-peak fares are a reasonable price. I mean, not wonderful, but reasonable. The key issue there is that the unregulated fares, they have total control over. So if I wanted to take a train from London to Manchester at the peak, and I was popping along to Euston Station at 8:30, I would be paying £320. Now, that doesn't make sense in any respect, particularly as the industry is heavily subsidised and people should be able to get access to trains at a reasonable price.
Well, Rick in Walthamstow has texted us and he says train prices are disgustingly, his word, expensive. He says he tried to book London to Newcastle this weekend, and that's off-peak, isn't it? Cheapest return was £140. He says, how can they justify that?
Yes, I somewhat suspect there might be a football match or something there which has kind of then absorbed all the cheap tickets, and he is basically paying the standard off-peak fares. I'm slightly surprised it's as high as 140, but I'm sure he must be right. But it is 200 miles up to Newcastle, isn't it? So that's quite a long distance, and they base those off-peak fares basically on distance.
Christian Wolmar, stay with us. Lynn is in the London area, and Lynn, you've given up your car.
Yes, we gave up our car 2 years ago because we basically didn't really use it in London. We've got very good bus services, we've got the tube, and we've got the overground train, and the car was just sitting outside our house. It's also very difficult to park in London. So we made the very wise decision to give our car up, and we haven't regretted it.
Do you commute?
No, at the moment, my husband commutes across London to work. I worked, and he goes on the tube, and I work locally. So it was fine. We do have zip cars, the street cars. So if we do need to hire a car, if we do need a car, we hire one. But I don't think we hire the car more than once or twice a year. And usually to take my youngest son to university, that's the only reason we need it now.
Lynn Stevens in London, thank you. Darren is in Waterbeach.
Yes, I'm from Waterbeach. Yeah, we regularly get the train from Waterbeach to Cambridge, but lately it's just extremely overcrowded.
And is that because it's term time and people are going into work and
well, it just seems every day, like in the commuting times. I used to get the train with a bike. I do have a mountain bike. It got to a point where I couldn't get the bike on the train, so I got a fold-up bike. And then I was still being left stranded on the platform, not being able to get on the train at all. So now I've just got myself a proper commuting bike and cycle all the way to work from Waterbeach to Cambridge, which takes me about half an hour.
Well, Darren in Waterbeach, thank you. Peter Webb is in Liverpool, and you travel to Guildford from Liverpool. Is that an easy connection?
Yes, it's a service on the West Coast Main Line run by Virgin, and it's a really good service. It takes me 3 hours from Liverpool Lime Street to Guildford.
Do you go direct? Do you go direct, or do you have to go into London?
Go into Euston, and then get the tube across London, and then Waterloo to Guildford, and I do it from station to station in 3 hours.
But you don't think HS2 is going to improve that service at all?
Well, one thing that nobody's talked about is how much these tickets are going to cost. So who's going to be able to afford to use HS2? And secondly, I don't think I need to go any quicker than 3 hours.
But you could argue that these things need improving, because I remember not very many years ago, that journey between Liverpool Lime Street and London was 4 hours, not 2 hours.
Well, we're down to 2 hours and 7 minutes now.
So you think, what about HS3 though? Would you ever think that we need better communication, better connections between Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds and Hull?
Yes, definitely. I think the north of England, like Scotland, is actually brassed off with Westminster government. And what we want to see in the north is some commitment to us. And the developing transport links within the north is clearly going to help us. And let's look at the facts. If you're going to develop HS2, all you're going to do is extend the commuter belt for London and suck more and more people into London. And our country really doesn't need that. We're too lopsided, and politicians aren't addressing this.
Peter in Liverpool, thank you. We were talking earlier about how wonderful the trains are in Northern Ireland. Ian Dylan Quinn on Twitter says, trains in Northern Ireland are awful if you live in the west, because there are none. We're not important enough. Oh, well, balance. Carolyn Atkinson has been reading all your emails. Carolyn, what are you finding?
Well, this one sums up the feelings of a lot of listeners. Bill says, the distance from Scarborough to Whitby is 20 miles. If I wished to travel this afternoon by train, it'll take 4 hours, 20 minutes at a single fare cost of £50. But to travel from Scarborough to King's Cross this afternoon, the journey can be done in 3 hours at a single fare cost of £108. So he says this hardly represents good travel services in the north of England. Replacement of lost track in the area is vital for travellers in this area. HS2 is not. Cross-country links are a big bugbear. Marion, who describes herself as a very frequent rail traveller, says the money could be better spent on improving the existing network and resurrecting and building new strategic cross-country links. For example, she says, Bristol to Cambridge routes that avoid London and massively reduce congestion. HS2 is a vanity project which will merely extend the London commuter belt to Birmingham. And similar feelings from Ellie Coop, a student in Bath. She says, I think it's ridiculous how much it costs to get home to York. Just under £100 travelling through London. This is a big issue for all students, and I know many who just can't afford to visit home during the term time. But somebody who is in favour of high-speed trains all round, Jenny says we have HS1 between Canterbury and London, and it can be summed up in one word: fantastic. I now never use the slow trains. They're uncomfortable. They take a third longer to complete the journey. We ought to invest in the future and make all new train routes high speed wherever it is possible. Lots of complaints from particular areas of the country. I would say Devon and Cornwall and Wales seem to come out on top. Pat says we're particularly poorly served by both rail and road in Devon and Cornwall. This was demonstrated, as we've been hearing, when west of Exeter, including Plymouth, was cut off by rail last winter. Similar concerns from Casa. She says, my nearest train station is 35 miles away. I'd be very delighted to have even the slowest service a bit nearer, as we used to have. That was 14 miles away in Oakhampton. And Yasmin Ali says, I approve of HS2 and HS3. Britain's infrastructure is ramshackle, but let's hear about poor Wales. There is no rail link between North, South and Mid Wales other than by going the long way round via England. A little solution here from Clive. He says, why do we still have trains which have first-class carriages empty with loads of staff and the rest of the train bursting with one person serving hundreds of passengers?
Carolyn, thank you. Well, Joey Wilson is in Northamptonshire near Banbury. You think they should do HS3 before they do HS2?
I do indeed. The big problems in the country with the north-south divide, the two issues the Prime Minister's been talking about is capacity and the north-south divide. They should do the north first, sort that out. Capacity, it's not about speed. Why do they have to go in a straight line? That was the original thing that was when this proposal first came out. I'm so cross about this. When this proposal first came out, it was all about speed and the business case. Those have been shot to bits. It's now about capacity and the north-south divide. Do the north first and then think about having another rail service to sort out capacity. But why go in a straight line? Why not go up an existing transport corridor? It doesn't make sense, ruining vast swathes of countryside when it could go up an existing transport corridor.
Let me, Joe, stay with us. Just let me put that to Christian Woolmar, who's still with us.
Yes, I must say, it sounds like Joe's been reading articles on my website, www.christianwoolmar.co.uk.
Thanks for the plug there.
Here. We've had the select committee out here yesterday morning. They have spent a morning, 4 MPs from the select committee were here. They spent a morning doing the entire South Northamptonshire area, just a morning. And it was how they can justify this project that's going to cost $100 billion when it should be an existing transport corridor and sort the north out first.
Right. No, I mean, in fairness, it is actually more like $50 billion. But I do agree with your basic point that one is, I think the North and railways need improving immediately. And as I've written a piece in the Times today, they're actually still got these ghastly Pacer trains. They're actually, as David Blunkett said, cutting back on services in the franchise specification. And yet now they're promising this jam tomorrow, well, a long time tomorrow. So I totally agree that HS3 ought to be considered before HS2. HS2 is certainly, as Joe says, the wrong route. It's a misconceived project, and it would be much better if it went up nearer the M1 as was once originally suggested, but for various complicated reasons it's going another way.
Christian, just go back to this idea, this problem with antiquated rolling stock. You mentioned the Pacer trains.
Yeah.
Will the rolling stock be updated? And if so, who'll pay for it?
Well, the real worry about this is that these Pacer trains, of which there's 140 train sets still running around the northern network, and they're sort of like buses on tracks, really, with kind of bus seats. And the real worry is that they were supposed to be phased out in 2019 because they don't comply with disability legislation, which is going to become mandatory in 2019. And in a recent consultation paper, the Department for Transport said, actually, maybe we can adapt these trains, which means that these trains which are built in the 1980s might still be running around the network in the 2030s when, if things go to plan, there'll be shiny new high-speed trains running up to the north as well. So it'll be very strange that they haven't prioritised that. And I think everybody in the north that is listening to this ought to write to their MP, put pressure on to get new trains for the north, which should be an absolute priority, as David Blunkett said.
Well, Joe Rukin, who campaigns against HS2, says HS3 just proves, as it stands, that HS2 means allowing more people to get out of the north and work in London. Is he right? Is it? And we've heard this from callers today. It'll just suck people to London.
I think there's a lot of evidence that is the case. There's a Professor John Tamani who's done research on the effect of high-speed lines across the world, and to most part, they profit the city that is biggest, in other words, the existing big city, and don't necessarily lead to regeneration in the smaller cities. You only have to go to Lille, for example, in France, which is given as an example where the high-speed line has done a lot of good, and certainly it's done quite a lot of good in the immediate surrounds of the station. But if you walk sort of a kilometre away from the station, you'll find that Lille is still the same rundown place that it was when the mining and steel industries closed 20, 30 years ago.
Well, stay with us, Christian. Josie Smith is near Lampeter in Cardiganshire in West Wales. And earlier we were hearing Carolyn Atkinson talking about the fact that there are so limited train services in Wales. Josie, what's your experience?
Well, the Marples and Beeching removed the railway lines in the late 60s, so there is no link. I travel up to London fairly regularly, And it's an hour on the bus to the station, and there's no link between Carmarthen and Aberystwyth. There's no link, as was said earlier, between North Wales and South Wales, which is ridiculous, or East and West Wales. You have to actually travel into England by train to get from the north to the south of Wales, which is so wrong. We have a university in our town in Lampeter. It's a great university. Students' population is dropping because they have no transport. I think it's the only university town in the whole country with no rail link at all. And I think rather than, shave off a few minutes from long journeys, we need to look at the whole rail network in this country, ensure that everybody is adequately connected. And as has been said, there's decent rail stock, and really it ought to be renationalised.
Well, apart from the nationalisation issue, just let me put that to Christian, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. There is an issue with substantial swathes of the UK that don't have any rail at all. So are we all getting excited about HS2, HS3 without actually thinking about what Josie was suggesting?
Look, I'm afraid that, yes, Beeching did cut something like 5,000 miles of railway, and some of it shouldn't have been cut. And so something like nearly 1,000 miles have been restored in one way or another. And indeed, in Scotland, they're building the Borders Railway, which restores one of its cuts down to south of Edinburgh, and that's very exciting. But you can't really expect that in this day and age, when a large proportion of people have cars, that you're going to build lines into rural parts of particularly the areas that people have been complaining about, Devon, Cornwall and Wales. It's just not going to happen. It just would not be remotely economic, and unfortunately those lines are lost forever.
Christian, stay with us. Louise in Leeds, you've got 30 seconds to tell me what you think.
Okay, I used to live in London. I'm amazed at the population opportunities in the north, and I despair that we'd rather dig up half of the country to shave 20 minutes off a perfectly good journey instead of encouraging the north to become what it could be.
Louise in Leeds in West Yorkshire, thank you. Christian Walmar, rail analyst, thank you for joining us. Just before we go, we've had an anonymous text. He says, here in Devon, we don't expect life in the fast track, but a railway that doesn't get washed away when it rains would be nice.